An extraordinary week of fellowship and learning. And it's going to come to an end, but it's going to come to an end with a bang. I cannot think of any person that is better suited to sum up this week for all of us than our next speaker, Daniel Sheehan. You know, I kind of have this sort of idea that usually the really brilliant men, the really smart men, the men that have vision and can lead, are so often drawn to the dark side. Because the forces that have brought us to this point are brilliant, but they're also pretty dark. But we've got some really brilliant people that are working for the good. And Danny Sheehan is one of those people. He's been involved in public advocacy his entire life. He rubs shoulders with the people that actually make things move, shake, and change. And for once, we have one of these brilliant men with a heart, with his heart for the people and for the planet that's on our side. Ladies and gentlemen, Danny Sheehan.
Well, good afternoon. This is actually my third presentation that I've been privileged to make at the International UFO Congress. The first was back in 1994 in my capacity as the legal counsel for Dr. John Mack. At that time, you recall, Dr. Mack had been brought before a committee of the faculty of Harvard University as a result of his having published his book, Abduction: Encounters Between Humans and Aliens. And I was asked at that time to come before the Congress to give a briefing as to how that had gone, that confrontation with the Harvard faculty. The second presentation was in the year 2000, in March, in my capacity then as the former director of President Mikhail Gorbachev's State of the World Forum's strategic initiative to identify a new post-Cold War paradigm. This third opportunity brings me before you today in my capacity as general counsel to the Disclosure Project in Washington, D.C., and also as general counsel to the Institute for Cooperation in Space, based in Los Angeles. This in fact is actually only my fourth major public presentation on the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the issue of unidentified flying objects. The third had been my presentation in July of 2001 to the International MUFON Symposium in Irvine. At that time, I appeared before the MUFON Symposium to warn them in July of 2001 to warn the UFO community and the American community in general against yielding to the calls by the second Bush administration to support the construction and deployment of a major strategic defense initiative, the so-called Missile Shield, as a purported rational response to the threat of potential terrorist attacks upon United States territory. Directly in the face of rather vociferous opposition from some of the people at the MUFON symposium. I, in fact, was accused of somehow challenging the credibility of our president when he represented that the missile shield proposal was in fact a rational, strategic response to the threat of terrorism. I pointed out in those discussions that it was perfectly clear that the much greater threat of potential terrorist attacks upon our country came from low technology, the carrying of backpacks into large cities with explosives, or vials of bacteria, or in fact hijacking American aircraft and exploding them over the major cities of our country. At that time, I pointed out that in light of this fact, I viewed the efforts on the part of George W. Bush to deceive the American public into believing that the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars in the development and deployment of a Star Wars missile shield defense was in fact a deception and a distraction. In fact, a positive disservice to the protection of the national security of our nation against the actual threat of terrorism. At the MUFON conference in July of 2001, I, however, directed my primary remarks to the second half of my critique of this Star Wars position, pointing out that it seemed much more likely that this major technology, rather than being a bona fide effort to protect our nation state against terrorist attacks, had every indication of being a major technology that may well be being designed and deployed to mount military assaults against potential extraterrestrial vehicles coming to our country. Those of you who may have heard of my remarks at that MUFON symposium will know what the position is that I took there. But what I want to do today here is to focus on the other half of the remarks that I was making at that conference, the actual terrorist threat which faces us, the events of September 11th, and then to return to the basic theme of how these events actually impact the issues that we came together this week to discuss. Now, in coming here this week, you may have heard some rumors of comments that I had made at the local Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area UFO Expo last week on the 15th of September, just a few days after the attacks on New York and Washington. That you may have heard that some of the people there, in being present for the keynote address that I made, I was in fact invited at the last minute to make the keynote address at that local regional gathering because Richard Hoagland canceled his appearance, saying that he thought that it was inappropriate to go forward with the gathering. And the guest speaker for the keynote address was unable to get out of Boston. So Victoria Jacks contacted me and asked if I would be available to make the opening keynote address, and I did. So many of the people there, some of the people there at least, were disturbed because it was the first time within the first 100 hours of the attacks that they had heard anyone raise a voice expressing concern about the events that had taken place, not from the point of view of simply blindly supporting the calls on the part of the executive branch for mobilization for war. It was the first time that they had heard anyone raise a voice that they thought was somehow being critical of the president in times of crisis, or somehow unsupportive of the nation in the midst of its mobilization for war. What I would like to do this afternoon in my brief comments is to expand and amplify my remarks that were made at the MUFON conference in July, and to make clear that what I am saying here is that I believe that the crisis in which we find ourselves presently engulfed here, just 10 days after the attacks on New York and Washington, represents not simply a potential calamity for our nation that is even more extensive than you might possibly have imagined up to this point, but that it also represents an opportunity for a potential new future which could in fact transform the events of this Black Tuesday into an actual test which, if we are able to pass this test presented to us, might just qualify us as a species for citizenship in the larger galactic family, which we have all been striving to merit throughout our entire lifetimes. To context this presentation, I would like to first briefly review the main points of the presentation that I made at the year 2000 UFO Congress. So you can see how this opens on to the explanation of what these events of the past week really have meant. In that presentation, very briefly, I explained some of my background, in which I pointed out that in addition to my having been legal counsel for Dr. John Mack at Harvard, I had also been contacted by the United States Congressional Research Service back in 1977 by Miss Marcia Smith, who was the head of the Science and Technology Division of the Library of Congress Congressional Research Service. He was asked to participate in the preparation of a major study which had been requested by President Carter on the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. I pointed out that in that context, I had gained access to a portion of the Project Blue Book files that had previously been classified, and I had personally seen photographs in those classified documents which convinced me that the United States government had in fact recovered one or more extraterrestrial vehicles. And therefore, I pointed out that I was prepared to make a number of basically conservative assumptions about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon, which I shared with the Congress at that time in March of 2000. I set forth 12 basic conservative assumptions about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence, and I pointed out that as a result of these presumptions, I thought that there were 7 basic potentially alternative theoretical explanations for what the UFO phenomenon was in light of the assumptions that I shared about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence. I pointed out that it was my opinion that these 7 alternative explanations for the phenomenon seemed to be the result of the imposition upon sometimes ambiguous and extraordinary data of alternative worldviews that we as human beings tend to adopt. And therefore, the data that we were experiencing was being extrapolated upon as a result of the worldviews that the observer shared. And therefore, there had resulted within the UFO community, the public interest community, a tendency to engage in attacking each other and condemning and criticizing each other's opinions about the phenomenon, which tended, in my opinion, to potentially render this particular public interest community less effective than we might otherwise be. I pointed out that I had served as legal counsel to a number of major public interest organizations throughout the years, which had resulted in major investigations of everything from the private nuclear industry in the Karen Silkwood case, in which I served as chief counsel, all the way to the Iran-Contra investigations, in which I supervised the major private investigation of the off-the-shelf enterprise of Oliver North and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim. And I was the first person to testify before the United States Congress in October of 1986 to reveal to the Congress the existence of this off-the-shelf operation, which generated the appointment of Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh. In that context, I pointed out that based upon my experience in dealing with other major public interest organizations, I had found similar difficulties, and that therefore I might be able to be of some counsel to our public interest community dealing with the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. I pointed out that I'd been asked to initiate this type of a council for the Disclosure Project in Washington, D.C., and for the Institute for Cooperation in Space in Los Angeles. And therefore, I proposed that we start out by endorsing a set of fairly conservative principles, which I thought were pretty much beyond any really justifiable dispute, and that we move forward there to support the undertaking of a major private professional investigation, as we had in the Silkwood case, in the Iran-Contra case, and with regard to the American Sanctuary Movement that I served as general counsel for, and that we therefore bring this to some more effective focus and resolution. I thought that this was necessary, as I pointed out in my concluding remarks, in order for us to focus upon what I thought was the most fundamental question in this public area, and that was whether or not there exists some type of an ultimate covert operation in our country, pursuant to which technology recovered from one or more extraterrestrial vehicles is being back-engineered for the purpose of constructing some type of offensive missile system or offensive weapons system to be deployed to undertake offensive military action against members of an extraterrestrial civilization, which might potentially plunge our human family into a long-term military conflict which could be ultimately disastrous to our people without our knowledge or consent, which I viewed to be fundamentally unconstitutional. And at the same time, I thought that it was necessary to get to the bottom of this particular question in order to develop an alternative paradigm, a new world view, on the basis of which we would be able to, together as citizens on our planet, overcome this potential tendency to respond to the extraterrestrial presence with a military option, or, on the other hand, to simply fall down before this extraterrestrial civilization and put ourselves into an ultimately subservient posture, failing to understand what the particular qualities of our human species may well be, which not only entitle us to full and equal membership in the galactic civilization, but which in fact might even make us an extraordinary and indispensable element of such a civilization. Those were my remarks in the year 2000, in March, to the UFO Congress. In the year 2001, in July, at the MUFON conference, I amplified these, but focused on the missile shield point, saying that, in fact, it was perfectly clear to me that we needed to mobilize our citizenry to stop this weaponization of space, to pass this major test, as we were being challenged by a very small minority element among our human family that is devoted to this peculiar objective of moving into space with major weapons and making our species a potential threat, not only to ourselves, as we have been for some years, but in fact to other sentient beings in our galaxy. I left the MUFON conference with that challenge presented to them, but it was only in September, following the attack on our country, that I was therefore contacted and asked, in light of my comments about the missile shield, and in light of my comments about the failure of the administration to really take effective steps to protect our country against terrorism, what my thoughts were with regard to this issue. That presentation basically needs to be divided into two parts. It is basically the fundamental question that we need to address of exactly where are we as a human family now, at this particular point in history. And what exactly is it that is going on our planet? And what exactly is it that we can most effectively do to constructively participate in this unique moment of human history? Now, this question, following September 11th, needs to be divided into two parts. It needs to be divided first into what are the answers to those questions prior to September 11th, and what different answers might be posed to those questions after September 11th. Taking the first part, let us focus on where we actually are as a species now. We realize that where we are, for all of our lives, of everyone basically in this community, we have been born into and have grown up during an 80-year period of a major dialectical confrontation between two major ideological forces among our species. This has been a major confrontation which began in 1917 with the creation of the Soviet Union, which rose as an antithesis to the Western civilization's thesis of Western capitalism, a Western, actually bicameral, parliamentarian, democratic capitalism. In 1917, the Soviet Union was established as an antithesis to this thesis, posing the antithesis of Eastern Bloc Soviet totalitarian communism. And all of us, every one of us in this room, have spent the overwhelming majority of our lives prisming our entire reality through this particular dialectical conflict. Everything in our lives primarily was focused on this primary problem. Up until 1991, December 21st of 1991, when the Soviet Union voluntarily dissolved itself, this was the operative dynamic, the fundamental underlying operative dynamic of the culture of our planet. In June of 1989, some 30 months prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, wrote an extraordinary essay in Public Interest magazine, which was published around the world, in which he warned the leaders of Western civilization, the political, economic, and cultural leaders of Western civilization, that the Soviet Union was going to collapse in the immediate future and that this was going to confront the political, economic, and cultural leaders of Western civilization with an unanticipated dilemma. On the one hand, they were going to be ecstatic and overwhelmed with joy at the collapse of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, they were going to be confronted for the first time in almost 100 years with no longer having anyone to blame for their failure to fulfill the fundamental promises of Western civilization and the democratic promise. For almost 100 years, the political and cultural and economic leaders of Western civilization had rationalized their failure to fulfill these promises with the excuse that it wasn't possible. Well, we have to spend $300 billion a year protecting ourselves against this ultimate communist threat. Oh, there's this other threat we've got with Hitler, who has taken a different position as to how they should oppose communism. And therefore, there's this major fundamental conflict going on within the northern states of our planet as to how we should go about resolving this fundamental debate about how we're going to develop the natural resources of our planet and distribute them among our human family. We're unable right now to get to this fundamental set of promises. But, as Professor Fukuyama pointed out, very soon, much sooner than any of the so-called experts predict, he stated in this essay, which was entitled "The End of History," we are going to be confronted with the lack of anyone to blame for this. So he suggested in June of 1989 that the Western leaders gather together very quickly to begin to work on identifying the fundamental underlying principles and promises of Western democratic civilization so that we could be prepared upon the fall of the Soviet Union to move into place the principles, the policies, and the programs of the promises of Western civilization so as to fill the void, the vacuum that would be created in the fall of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the leaders of Western civilization ignored this essay, not believing that it was at all possible that the Soviet Union, that had loomed so large in the defining of the paradigm of our reality for all these past 80 years, could possibly simply disappear in such a short amount of time. And therefore, they ignored the warning. So, on December 21st of 1991, when in fact the Soviet Union did collapse, just as Professor Fukuyama predicted, the Western civilization was caught basically with its paradigms down. And quickly responding to this problem, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor for the liberal democratic administration of President Jimmy Carter, came to the fore and published a major white paper called The Out of Control, the Threat of Global Chaos on the Eve of the 21st Century, he said. And he pointed out there that, in fact, it was going to be essential to establish a new organizing principle for our planet here at the end of the Cold War. That we no longer had this dialectical dynamic going on between Western civilization and the Soviet Union so as to engine the basic ethical, normative decision-making processes of our culture. And therefore, we were going to have to discover some new organizing principle to replace it. He suggested in this essay that we try to identify, that we gather together the cultural, political, and economic leaders of the world, and that we seek to identify a set of ethical principles, fundamentally moral in their nature, and that we ask the leaders of Western civilization to voluntarily comport their conduct in accordance with this set of ultimately moral ethical principles. And that in doing so, we therefore, in Western civilization, strike a better balance between the continued pursuit of what he said was the actual ideal of Western civilization, which he defined as permissive cornucopia. This simple blind pursuit of material greed and power and access to material wealth and power on the part of our private individuals. that we strike a better balance between the continued pursuit of that ideal and the more effective addressing of the basic problems of our human family on the planet, which he identified as the continued threat of nuclear in mass destruction through the development of weapons systems. The second was the gross, unjust distribution of the natural resources of our planet among the human family. And thirdly, the spoliation of our entire environment on our planet through the greed and personal avarice of major industries and corporations in Western civilization that were generating global warming in the major destruction of the rainforests and the depletion of the ozone layer. And finally, he said the fourth major problem was the unbridled pursuit of technology, pursuing additional weapons systems, and even to the point of probing into the genetic makeup of our own human family and threatening to destroy and damage the genetic material of our human family for all future posterity. Now, he set this forth in a major response to Fukuyama's challenge of 50 months earlier, but instantaneously, in response to this liberal proposal, the conservative community in Western civilization responded through Professor Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington is the Olin Institute Director of International Relations at Harvard University. He is also a major spokesperson for the Council on Foreign Relations of the Trilateral Commission of David Rockefeller. He is also the president of the American Association of Political Science. This is no mere person standing on a soapbox on a corner. This is a major power among the leaders of Western civilization. He responded to this liberal proposal on the part of Zbigniew Brzezinski by saying in a major essay published in Foreign Affairs magazine, undisputably the most influential single publication in the field of foreign policy in Western civilization. He published a major article, which was the most widely read article since the publication of George Kennan's major article in Foreign Affairs magazine advocating the Marshall Plan. And he proposed in this article, which was entitled "The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order," he asserted that we should defy the request on the part of Zbigniew Brzezinski and the liberal community in Western civilization. We should not, in fact, engage in any type of undertaking to attempt to identify some vague set of ethical principles fundamentally moral in their nature and ask people to voluntarily comply with these, because if not, there was a threat of global chaos on our planet. He said that the alternative challenge that was really facing our planet at the end of the Cold War was the threat of the rise of the Asian empire. He said that China was going to be rising in the next 20-year period to a position of major cultural and economic power, to the point where they would ultimately, within 20 years, be dominating all of the planet and dominate Western civilization. And that he called for the mobilization of Western civilization not to attempt to identify some set of global principles that could apply globally to everyone. He said, instead of doing that, what we should do is direct our attention to identifying those exclusive principles which distinguish Western civilization from Asian civilization. And, by the way, he said, Islamic civilization as well. And what he did is he issued a clarion call to the political and economic and cultural leaders of Western civilization to band together to actually establish a physical territory of Western civilization, including maps in his book, which he published 2 years later of the same title, in which he said, here are the boundaries, the high water marks of Western civilization geopolitically. This was a map of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. And he put these maps in his article and in his book, and he said, these bound the territory of Western civilization. And within Western civilization, which, by the way, include all of South America and all of Sub-Saharan Africa, because these, he said, are Christian civilizations. And that what we should do is we should focus upon those unique qualities of our Western civilization which distinguish us from Asian and Islamic civilization. And we should self-consciously strengthen these principles within our borders. Therefore, we should understand that we should get past all of these inclinations to multiculturalism and all of this multi-ethnic engagement that we're engaged in Western civilization. We should understand that our civilization is in fact defined by the call of Western, Caucasian, Catholic Christianity. And that there is an undertone as well of Judeo-Christian ethics in this. But that ultimately the organizing principle resonates with a Catholic, Christian, Caucasian worldview. Now, that was a serious bone chiller to read that type of proposal from a person that has the kind of influence and power that Samuel Huntington has. What happened after the publication of his article, that there began to be a dialogue going on between the advocates of Zabrinsky's liberal organizing principle and the conservative proposals made by Samuel Huntington. But there threatened to be a monopoly, basically, actually a duopoly going on, that these were the only two possible alternatives that could really be entertained by anyone. So, actually at that point, I was contacted by President Mikhail Gorbachev, actually the director of his Gorbachev Foundation, Dr. James Garrison, and asked if I would chair a basic commission of world leaders to try to identify some alternative paradigm to the classic Western liberal, democratic liberal paradigm, or the Republican conservative paradigm, to at least put on the table some type of alternative set of choices that our human family might have from among which to choose. I did, in fact, accept that position, and up until the year 2000, I chaired that and directed that strategic initiative to identify a new post-war paradigm. And we identified 7 alternative paradigms that actually splay themselves out across a continuum that have been elucidated by our human family at various times in history and have in fact constituted the fundamental predicates of a major civilization at any given time in our human history. And as it turns out, these in fact were these alternative paradigms that I elucidated at the year 2000 UFO Congress, underlying the alternative worldviews that people bring to the phenomenon of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon, by means of which they prism that data and come to their own conclusions about what this phenomenon really represents. As it turns out, that in the year 2000 presidential election, 5 of the 7 major human paradigms were actually represented by political candidates. That we had the classic, we had the conservative paradigm, which is the third of the 7 paradigms, represented by the conservative Republican Party in George W. Bush. We had the 4th paradigm, which is the moderate paradigm, sort of directly in the center of the spectrum, represented by the Democratic Party, the new, more moderate Democratic Party, the party of Bill Clinton, the party of Al Gore and Joe Lieberman and Richard Gebhardt, not the liberal party of Adlai Stevenson and others, but it's the new, more moderate Democratic Party was represented. The liberal position, which is the 5th paradigm of the 7, was actually represented by the Green Party and by Ralph Nader. It was a little bit eclectic and unfocused, and but that's what they were attempting to do. And actually, the sixth paradigm, the kind of progressive paradigm, was actually represented by the Natural Law Party and John Hagelin. And it turns out that the second paradigm, the reactionary paradigm, which is even more conservative than the normal conservative paradigm of the third paradigm, the reactionary paradigm was represented by Patrick Buchanan and the Reform Party. The only two that were not represented of the 7 major human paradigms was the extreme right-wing paradigm of totalitarian authoritarianism and the extreme 7th paradigm, which is the utopian kind of theological, deistic paradigm. Now, what happened in the election, and this is just to locate us so that we need to get ourselves grounded in a time of crisis like this to really understand what some of the fundamentals are. Ideally, much like in teaching a class in world government or world politics, I'm not saying anything that you haven't heard before. What I'm trying to do is structure it and organize it in a way that enables us to make concrete decisions about the fundamental issues that we've come together this week to talk about. What happened in the year 2000 election is, number one, only 48% of the eligible voters even chose to vote. It means 52% of all of the eligible voters in the United States didn't even bother voting. Of the 48% that voted, 24% of them voted for Al Gore. 23% of them voted for George Bush. And about 1% divided itself among the Greens, the Natural Law Party, and the smallest number were given to the Reform Party. Now, George W. Bush came into office, therefore, with only 23% of the eligible voters of our nation. But despite all of his talk about setting up a government of compromise and dialogue and sharing power and all that, he in fact moved right directly to the classic conservative agenda. In fact, as it turns out, not coincidentally, it was exactly the agenda of his father. And he began the same exact policies that his father did. First, he recommended a $1 trillion tax cut, that 85% of which would go to the top 5%, the wealthiest 5% of the people in the country. Then he recommended this interesting, which is a kind of sub rosa, $1 trillion military buildup in form of the Star Wars, the SDI, same one that his father had been involved with Reagan, of building this huge missile shield. And thirdly, he said that he wanted to basically ignore all of the talk about global warming and the whole Kyoto Accords that rejected the International Panel on Climate Control of the United Nations, saying that he wasn't really sure at all that there was such a thing as global warming, and wanted to get out of the Kyoto Accords. And then, of course, he wanted to get out of the treaty of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which is going to kind of unilaterally abrogate that treaty. Why not? Treaties are kind of sophisticated. You'd actually have to have more than a C average in high school to understand that. Then what he did is he said he in fact wanted to didn't have to worry about the debt. All of this kind of debt talk was kind of strange. Why worry about the debt? Because if we're going to give a $1 trillion tax rebate and then have a $1 trillion military budget, so the whole surplus that had actually been generated over an 8-year term of the Clinton administration was going to be used up. In fact, it would result that when the baby boom generation began to come to retirement age, they would have to borrow more money because there was no surplus. They were actually going to invade the Social Security lockbox. They were going to invade the Social Security fund and pay that money out as well. Just exactly the same position that his father had taken. And what's wrong with debt? I mean, in fact, the entire banking industry runs on debt. The fact is, our debt is their profit. That's how the whole system works. So what's so bad about that, he said? Being on the end that received the profit rather than the debt as a rule. And so he began this program, but most importantly, he continued a major program which had been underway from his father's administration that is less known to our people. And that is, he began to press forward on the construction of a major new international super state, which is termed the Northern Industrial Alliance, which is quite unknown to most everyone here, but in fact was the subject matter of a major white paper that was prepared by his father and with his head of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, back in 1991. It was a strategic paper that was called The Projection of U.S. Military Power into the 21st Century and Beyond. And in that white paper, they specifically advocated restructuring the entire military structure of the United States military to move away from strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bombers and to move into, you may have heard about this, the ability to launch 2 major theater-level wars at one time, and to move a significant amount of money into a new alternative form of war, which they called low-intensity conflict. Low-intensity conflict was covert warfare. Low-intensity conflict is conflict which is undertaken primarily by the Operations Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency under Section 5412 of the National Security Act of 1947, in which they are authorized to engage in major covert operations. These are the exact same kind of covert operations which in fact generated the Iran-Contra scandal. The major assassination of foreign heads of state, the rounding up of people who oppose U.S. economic policy and having them tortured by people who are financed by the American Central Intelligence Agency, such as went on in Latin America against the Nicaraguan Sandinista. That actually led to the rise of the Sandinista into power in Nicaragua because of the activities of Anastasio Somoza and his major National Guard down there. The same thing that happened in the Middle East with regard to the Shah of Iran and his major Savak forces, who capture and torture and execute thousands of people who oppose the economic policies of the Shah of Iran, which were in fact, not coincidentally, directly contrary to the policies of Mossadegh, who was overthrown in 1954 in Iran by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Actually, the nephew of Roosevelt supervised that overthrow and put into power the Shah of Iran. Now, these are the kinds of policies that were the major focus of Bush and his administration. You shouldn't be surprised, since he was in fact the head of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976. The fact that he happened to think that was the way that the world should be addressed shouldn't have surprised anyone. And when he became Vice President of the United States in the Reagan administration, you should not either be surprised that he in fact was the de facto President of the United States for both of the administrations of Ronald Reagan. It wasn't Ronald Reagan any more than George W. Bush is the President of the United States at the present time. The simple fact is that as nice a fellow as a lot of people think President Reagan was, virtually everybody realized that it wasn't President Reagan that was really making the key decisions. Everybody knew that, but everybody kind of went along with that because he was such a nice guy and such a charming fellow and seemed to be kind of, innocent about the whole thing. But there were competent people behind him, such as George Bush, who was his vice president, and as such chaired the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council that made all decisions with regard to covert operations worldwide. And George Bush also happened to chair the South Florida Drug Interdiction Task Force that was responsible for allowing thousands of tons of cocaine to come flowing into the United States, which lo and behold, it turned out were being used to fund what? The military supply of the Contras and the purchase of TOW missiles going into Iran. And why were the TOW missiles going into Iran? Wasn't that strange? Why would we in fact sell TOW missiles to the Hezbollah, who were in fact avowed enemies of the United States? The fact of the matter is we sold the TOW missiles to the Hezbollah because the Hezbollah in October of 1984 had kidnapped William Buckley, the other William Buckley, not the famous author, but in fact the William Buckley who was the Beirut station chief for the United States Central Intelligence Agency, who was in fact supervising major covert political terrorist activities against all of the opponents of the United States policies in the Middle East. And what were those policies in the Middle East? To protect the oil and the access to the oil. The same reason that George Bush Sr. fought the Persian Gulf War. which is now said with great facility by all of the major commentators whenever they mention the Persian Gulf War, of course, which was fought to protect the oil. But the fact is that during the entire buildup to that war, if anyone suggested that they were doing this in order to protect their access to the oil, you would have been considered unpatriotic. You would have been considered some type of Marxist analyst to suggest that that was actually going on. And now it rolls right off the tongue of every single one of the major commentators. They just talk about it just like water flowing down the hill. Now, the fact of the matter is that George Bush Sr. was the major dominant force inside both Reagan administrations, then his administration, and he is the dominant force inside the present administration. I don't believe that anybody with a political IQ above room temperature believes that George W. Bush is capable of being president of the United States. I just don't believe that it's true. What people think is that he represents a whole bunch of very competent people. There's a whole bunch of competent people around him, like Colin Powell and like, his Vice President Cheney, and he's got a great national security team, and he's got his father who gives some advice. But nobody, I can't believe that anybody really believes that he has anywhere near the credentials or the qualifications to be President of the United States. That what's happened here is we have all allowed ourselves to kind of fall into a posture where at first we didn't really believe it could possibly happen. And so people said, it can't really possibly happen. I'm not going to get too mobilized about this, And then you had commentators saying things like this, which you've all heard. They say, well, he's going to have his first debate now with Al Gore. Could be kind of problematic since he had a little bit less than a straight C average in high school and college. And here's Gore with a straight A average out of Harvard University. He's probably going to mop the floor with this guy. And you would hear commentators say, well, all George W. Bush has to do is not fall out of his chair. Not fall out of his chair during the debate, and he's going to exceed expectations. And if he can exceed these expectations, then his stock is going to go up. And that's what happened. We saw that happen time and time again. He would basically strap him into the chair before the debate would start, and he would say the same simple things over and over again. And then they mobilized the entire machinery of the Republican National Committee and Party and basically put him in as a figurehead. As a person who could get up there, and if you gave him the 3x5 card and just gave him a chance to talk about stuff, he would say that and get right off. And then all the more competent people all around him would move into place and do the large press conferences, would answer the questions, would do all the stuff. Now, the fact of the matter is that we knew that prior to September 11th, we all knew that this was going on. And we all knew that what was getting ready to happen was that while George W. Bush had this one term in office where he was going to push for the tax cut, push for the Star Wars, push for eliminating the surplus, generating a massive debt, was going to spend the Social Security reserve, was going to be doing everything he could to bolster petroleum and try to build new nuclear facilities, a very popular position among most people who've gone to college, that he was going to try to build major new nuclear facilities. Not the least of which is myself, who happened to represent Karen Silkwood, which declared unconstitutional the Price-Anderson Act, which placed the cap on the financial liability of the private nuclear facilities. Since the day we won that decision in June of 1979, not one single private nuclear facility has been ordered in the entire United States. And the reason for that is because anybody of borderline competence who analyzes that understands that it's absolutely ludicrous to try to do that, to try to power your house with atomic power. I mean, that's like trying to light your cigarette with a shotgun, and everybody knows that. So they said, look, there's alternatives. There's solar power, there's geothermal power, there's all kinds of alternative things. But we knew, before September 11th, all of us knew that George Bush Jr. was going to come on and he was going to advocate the major petroleum industry. Why shouldn't he? I mean, the first job he ever had when he came out of college was president of the Zapata Oil Company, which was owned by his family. Why shouldn't he? I mean, as far as his worldview is concerned, that's how you power things. And so that we knew he was going to be doing that, and just exactly like we knew every one of those things, we knew that the Democrats were going to win the Congress in 2002. I don't think that there's anybody who is even graduated from high school that doesn't believe that the Democratic Party was going to win the elections. All they have to do, they're going to win probably 6 additional seats in the United States Senate. You already see Jesse Helms is retiring, Strom Thurmond is retiring. You're seeing them all jumping off the ship now. That the Democratic Party is going to win in 2002. They're going to probably take from 13 to 20 seats in the House. And so they're going to have control of the United States Congress in the year 2002. And then everybody knows that George Bush is going to continue to do the kind of things he's going to be doing, and that by the time 2004 comes along, everybody's going to start saying, you know, the Democrats are going to say, give us a Democratic president. Give us a Democratic president and we can undo all of these things that this guy is doing. And we can get back on course. We can undo the spending us into debt. We can reestablish the economy. We can do all of these kind of things. And that, in fact, less people knew, but it's equally true, that the candidate of the Democratic Party was going to be John Kerry. John Kerry is the junior senator from Massachusetts who had been basically promised the vice presidential nomination in exchange for his agreement to step down in the investigation of the Senate Select Committee on Terrorism and Narcotics, investigating the entire Iran-Contra decision, when, lo and behold, much I assume everyone's surprised in this office, that all of a sudden the United States Congress found themselves incapable of figuring out what was going on in the Iran-Contra crisis. That they couldn't understand what was happening in that. It was too complicated for anybody to figure out what was happening. We figured out what was happening. You know, we filed a major lawsuit in February of 1986 that laid out in absolute and full detail, all the details. We had the tail numbers of the aircraft that were flying the weapons into Ilopango. We knew who was in charge of the Ilopango airlift. We knew they were landing them on John Hull's ranch. We knew, in fact, much to no one's surprise, that when Sawyer was shot down in the C-123 in March of 1986 over Nicaragua, lo and behold, inside Sawyer's wallet was found and a slip of paper with the private unlisted home telephone number of Donald P. Gregg, who turned out to be the National Security Advisor for Vice President George Bush. And when they actually found the house from which they were flying, because Eugene Hassenfuss, who escaped from that particular plane, when he was interrogated, gave a full interview, gave the location of the safe house. When they found the telephone records of the safe house, there were 11 members' telephones that were all named defendants in the lawsuit that we had filed. It didn't take a Rhodes Scholar or a rocket scientist to know what was going on in the Iran-Contra crisis. But the fact is, there was a choice made to step down from that investigation. Because, as Seymour Hersh has published in the New York Times, when he interviewed both Dan Inouye, the Democratic senator from Hawaii, who chaired the Senate Select Committee on the Iran-Contra crisis, and he interviewed Lee Hamilton, who chaired the House Select Committee on the Iran-Contra stuff, both of them acknowledged that exactly what was being said about the off-the-shelf enterprise in this interesting lawsuit that was filed down in Florida was all true. But if they had in fact gone forward with that, it would have required impeaching the President of the United States. And it would have required impeaching the Vice President of the United States, George Bush. And it would have required impeaching the Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese. It would have required impeaching the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs. You know, it would have required impeaching the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And what they said, both of them, in their interviews to Seymour Hersh, they said that we couldn't afford to impeach all of those men because it would have destabilized the United States administration at this unique moment in history when President Mikhail Gorbachev was in the process of making these extraordinary unilateral concessions to Western civilization at the end of this entire Cold War period. And so therefore, we had to compromise. We had to compromise the concepts of our American Constitution. We had to compromise the basic law enforcement policies of our nation. We had to compromise the entire concept of equal justice in our nation. And we had to turn the other way and allow these people to walk away. And it was Senator John Kerry, who chaired the Special Senate Select Committee on Terrorism and Narcotics, who in fact was the man who made the decision to step back from that investigation and to allow those people to walk away. And in exchange for that, he was promised by Don Regal. Regal came into his office and said specifically that the Democratic Party leadership will be very, very, very grateful to you, John, if you choose to step back on this investigation. Because the leadership of the Republican Party has now agreed to stop asking for military funding for the Contras, and they've agreed to support the Democratic Party proposal of providing covert funding to Chamorro, who is running in the Democratic election against the Sandinista in Nicaragua, and we will give her covert Central Intelligence Agency funding so she will beat the Sandinista. How would we feel about a foreign government funding one of the two major candidates in our country to be elected to pursue their policies? But they were going to compromise international law, the concepts of integrity, of the sovereignty of other nations, to foist their decision upon them. And John Kerry, the junior senator from Massachusetts, chaired that committee and made the choice to step down in exchange for an effective promise that he would be designated by Al Gore as the vice presidential candidate when Gore received the nomination. And Al Gore thought that he stood such a clear chance of winning against George W. that he could in fact exercise his power to choose his own vice president. And he went to Joe Lieberman, who happened to be the first of the Democrats who stood up and challenged Clinton when he was lying about whether or not he was having sexual relations with the woman. And so that's what happened. So he said, I'll take Joe Lieberman and play the Clinton card. I won't even have Clinton come and campaign for me. Clinton can just stay home, and I'll get Joe Lieberman and I'll play that card. And he didn't win. And so what we have is the entire leadership of the Democratic Party now going, shame on you, Al, for that. Al Gore is a political dead man. A political dead man. And no matter what he tries to do, he's not going to get the nomination of the Democratic Party. It's going to be John Kerry who's going to get the nomination. And so that all of this is taking place. All of this is taking place before you. Now, I know that we like to gather together and we read books about the kind of secret government, and we read books about how they're hiding the UFO information, etc. But if you don't understand the most basic, fundamental, operative principles of American politics, you're not going to be able to be effective at addressing the issue that you want to get addressed. You've got to know what the structures are and the dynamics are of the government with regard to whom you're trying to get to do things on this issue. So what I'm saying is that this is in fact what was getting ready to happen prior to September 11th. And it was just, the die was cast on this taking place. And it was going to be clear that when the presidential election took place in 2004, a major surge of people were going to come out to vote. Rather than 48% of the American public, you were probably going to get 53 to 55% of the American public to come out to vote. And probably 30% of the eligible electorate were going to vote for John Kerry for president. And the same 23% that voted for Bush before would vote for him again. So you'd have like a 30% for Kerry and 23% of the eligible voters for Bush, and he would lose. And Kerry would come into office. And Kerry would then move right straight to Zbigniew Brzezinski's layout of the whole liberal democratic paradigm, saying, oh, let's get engaged in a major crusade to identify a set of basic ethical principles that are fundamentally moral in their nature. And if we can get the leadership of Western civilization to voluntarily comport their conduct with these, we can in fact strike a better balance between the continued pursuit of other issues and the better addressing of these major world problems. And what would happen is they would not solve these world problems. They would not abandon the basic premise of permissive cornucopia. They would not abandon their commitment to the petroleum industry. The Democratic Party position is, the Republican George W. Bush position is that we're not going to stop doing petroleum at all. In fact, we're going to do more petroleum. We're going to dig up the northern slopes of Alaska. We're going to do more offshore drilling. We're going to be more dependent upon petroleum. You know, fie on all these people talking about global warming. The position of the Democratic Party is, well, we're going to reduce our dependence upon petroleum by 7% by the end of this decade. The International Panel on Climate Control of the United Nations states that if we do not reduce our planet's dependency upon the use of petroleum by the end of this decade by 70%, 70%, by 70%, we are going to be wedded, irrevocably wedded, to an 11.5 degree Fahrenheit rise in the mean temperature of our planet over the next 100-year period, which means a 40-inch rise in the sea levels, which means the utter destruction of some 26 nations and the devastation of some 30 other low-lying nations, and the destruction of places like New York City and the California coastline that will make September 11th look like a holiday. That is the Republican and Democratic Party agenda that was in place before September 11th. Now, what was our response to this? Our response to this was what I set forth in front of the MUFON conference in July of 2001. Look, we cannot stand by and allow this to happen. We cannot stand by and allow this to happen, because if we do, we are going to be responsible for the devastation of tens of hundreds of thousands of lives all throughout the world. Does anybody here think that the rest of the people in the world don't know this? That we are the only ones who don't seem to realize this? The fact is that certain peoples around the world do know this, and they're taking fundamental positions on this, and they're going to undertake radical action out of their helplessness and out of their hopelessness to attempt to bring this to the attention of the people of our country. This is why what happened on September 11th is not just a mere stroke of bad luck. This is not simply a mere accident or mere misfortune. This is, in fact, a tragedy of the high Greek nature. A tragedy is, in fact, the downfall of a major heroic figure brought about by that figure's failure to understand and to come to grips with a fundamental flaw at the center of his or her character. And that is why every single one of the reports that you hear refers to this as a tragedy. This is a tragedy that has befallen our people. And when they start to say that these people were completely innocent people, they at the same time refer over and over to the World Trade Towers as, in fact, the virtual symbol of the economic hegemony of our nation over the world. They refer to the United States Pentagon as the absolute symbol of American military domination of the planet. And yet, all the people who are there are completely innocent. They will, in fact, report, for example, they have the brother of the pilot of Flight 11 that came out of LaGuardia. And they'll say, he was a complete innocent. He went to Boston, and he went to the local technical high school, went on to college, went into the military, flew a major military air cargo in Vietnam for several years, and moved military equipment all through Vietnam, and like just any other innocent, and went then on to becoming an airline pilot. And everybody says, excuse me, what was that middle part there about him just kind of casually going into the military and flying transports all throughout Southeast Asia, while in fact we killed millions of people in Southeast Asia, carpet bombed those people into the Stone Age, dropped napalm onto them. Some of our people got that blown right back on them. What a tragedy that is. Now, what I am saying is that this is not to engage in a mere criticism of our country. This is not to engage in a mere criticism of George W. Bush. I wish that George W. Bush had gotten what he really wanted when he decided to run for the presidency. When he said, when he was interviewed, I don't think I have a chance to win, but I'd like to get a lot of national recognition so I can become the new commissioner of baseball. It's exactly what he said, you know. I myself would vote for him to be the commissioner of baseball. The fact of the matter is, here we find ourselves faced with one of the worst tragedies that we've had to confront in our lifetimes, and we have a person representing us who every time he gets up on camera, everybody starts to bite their fingernails and hopes that he'll get off camera without doing something really awful, like saying, we're going to have to mount a major crusade into the Middle East. Now, I would feel even more upset if I thought he knew what he was saying. If he had actually read even a single book about the Crusades. Or, when in fact, given the opportunity, he would basically whip out a wanted dead or alive poster. That's how we handle people down in the Southwest. You know? Now, I forgive him entirely for that. I'm not sure that I forgive us for putting him into that position. This is something that we have to be responsible for. Now, what I said to the people at the San Francisco misfortune that could have befallen anyone, not a mere stroke of bad luck that could have happened to any 6,000 people in the world, instead of the 6,333 that appear to have maybe perished in the trade towers. And not just any 200 people, but the 200 people that were working that day in the United States Pentagon. This, in fact, is a tragedy of the highest moment. And it presents us with a major crisis. Now, a crisis, as you all probably know, a crisis, the Chinese symbol for crisis, means the threat of major calamity. But it also means the potential opportunity for an extraordinary breakthrough in a positive direction. And what I shared with the people at the San Francisco Bay Area UFO Symposium was that we need to look at this crisis to understand what the potential opportunity is that we have before us. Because prior to September 11th, we were faced with the daunting task of attempting to mobilize the American people to understand that the threat of building this major missile shield on the planet was a test that we had to pass, that we had to somehow rise to the occasion to stop the weaponization of outer space in order to merit potential citizenship in the galactic civilization. Whereas now, what we have to do is we have to mobilize the American people and the people of Western civilization not to respond to this attack with unilateral, massive military destruction of tens of thousands of other innocent women and children and non-combatants. That what we have to do is we have to mobilize our people to understand that we are standing on the very brink of the creation of another Vietnam campaign. Those of us who were there back in 1963 and 64 and 65 have heard this same song before. We have seen these same men sit in circle and explain to us how they could, with precision bombing, go in and get these minorities out of there. How, in fact, the Viet Cong just represent a small minority in an independent country, a democratically supported country in South Vietnam, who want to have independence, who want to be like us. They would put people on in Vietnam to interview them about how much they liked the United States. And no one ever said, how come these people talk English? Why is it these people are talking English when they're being interviewed? And yet people would say, this person says that they like America. They say that they like this. They actually went to school in America. And therefore, there's just this little minority group who are, in fact, dupes of communism. It's the Soviet Union and China that have instigated this little group of renegade people that we can go right in a matter of a few months. We'll have them cleaned out by Christmas. We can go in and dig them out of their little caves, and we can get them. We can put them on the run. We have the most massive military power in the history of the entire human species at our disposal. And we can wipe these people out. We can bomb them into the Stone Age. And who's he talking about doing that to now? Afghanistan. As you might point out, who are just a couple degrees above the Stone Age right now. I mean, they've lived through major civil war. They were invaded by the second most powerful military power on the planet, 10 years ago, where the entire Soviet Union came in and mobilized to go after the Mujahideen inside the country. And who, in fact, put the money in? We put, through George Bush Sr., $3 billion of military equipment into the Mujahideen through Pakistan and President Zia. We, in fact, gave them 300 Stinger missiles, only 150 of which have they ever used up to this point in time. We, in fact, 2 weeks ago, sent $43 million from George Bush Jr. to the Taliban government to help us in the drug war, to eliminate the poppy fields, which are, in fact, the major source of funding for the Mujahideen that we supported. Just like the major opium fields were the major source of support for the forces in the Golden Triangle that supported the American policies in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. This is an absolute replay of the same scenario. And the fact of the matter is, we not only do not have to tolerate this, we cannot possibly tolerate this without failing the test that is before us. The test that is before us is whether or not we substantively qualify for citizenship in this galactic civilization. And we now have the test placed directly before us in a way that is undisputable. So we have this opportunity now to reach out to our American people, to reach out to each other and to say that we are going to call upon every asset and every resource at our disposal. Not only were we there, most of us, when we heard this song being played before, leading us to war in Vietnam, but in fact, we know what the test is that is before us. And we are all inclined to kind of shuffle around and pretend like, wow, the UFO issue and extraterrestrial intelligence. If you, in fact, do not use that asset at your disposal, that you know in your own private life is such an important issue to you that you come here to this conference year after year and you go to the other conferences, you, in fact, will be letting down not only your brothers and sisters in the rest of this country and your brothers and sisters in the rest of this planet, you will be letting down our species at this critical juncture at which we stand at the very brink of potentially bringing this type of contagion into the universe. And that is the test that I believe that we have before us today. And that is why I believe that it is not only appropriate that we gather ourselves together here, while others are saying, oh, this might be inappropriate. We, in fact, need to be engaged in just simple mourning and mobilizing for war against terrorism. This is not only appropriate, this is absolutely mandatory that we gather. That we, in fact, come to understand what the connection is between what is going on right now and what the promise is that lies just beyond the horizon of our species. That, I believe, is the test that is before us now. And I believe that if we rise to this test, that we will be able to demonstrate not only that we are entitled to participate in this galactic civilization as full and equal partners, but if we are able to reach down within ourselves and to overcome this temptation, to overcome this temptation to strike back with vengeance, to overcome this temptation to strike back out of fear, to hide and conceal the suspicions that we have that there is some type of karma functioning beneath these events, and let that be disappeared to all of us, and instead respond out of the lower chakra energy centers of our extraordinary device that has been developed over millions of years of evolution, to go with those temptations, which, by the way, are an extraordinarily important asset to us, which distinguishes us from some of the other civilizations. That they are in awe of the fact that we have these kind of emotions, that we are capable of such anger, of such passion, of such love, of such pathos. What the advantage is that we have is that we are capable of all of those emotions, which they have, for some reason, bred out of their species as a potential threat to their civilization, and now find themselves wanting those emotions again, coming to us to see how they can interbreed, how they can in fact establish hybrid species, so they can once again reclaim access to those types of emotions. If we can show that we are capable of these emotions, of fear and love and hatred and passion and patriotism and loyalty and devotion and courage, but at the same time we are capable of overcoming these drives when they are self-destructive. If we can reach into that other capacity that we have, that other capacity for loving, the other capacity for empathy and sympathy, that capacity for forgiveness, not only forgiveness of our enemies, but forgiveness of ourselves for our complicity in what has caused this tragic situation to befall us on Tuesday. We need to come to grips with our own responsibility for that, because we constitute only 6% of the entire human population, and every single year we share in 51% of all of the non-renewable resources that are developed on this planet in every single calendar year. And we feel entitled. And the hardest time for anyone to respond in an introspection, in an honest evaluation of what it is that he or she may have done that has brought a situation upon themselves, the hardest situation in which to do that is when one has been attacked and charged with that exact conduct. As I pointed out to the people in San Francisco, every single married person in this room knows what I'm talking about. They know that when in fact they are set upon by their mate and are accused of doing just exactly what it is that they've done, the exact response is to respond out of anger and defensiveness, and that's the last moment in which you'll ever really acknowledge that you did it. It takes you hours to finally come back to them and say, you know, you're right, I did do that. So we are faced with that exact challenge now. We have been struck upon the cheek by people who perceive themselves as having been offended and having been unjustly oppressed and victimized by us. This is the hardest time for us to look inside ourselves and come to grips with what it is that we know that we have done to contribute to this. And if in fact we are capable of finding that special quality that exists in our species and rising to this occasion and forgiving not only those who have assaulted us, but coming to understand why it is by their lights they did this, coming to understand what it is that we have done that may well have been understandably perceived by them as justifying what they did to us, and at the same time forgiving ourselves for having done it. And the only sign of true contrition is penance. And penance requires doing something about it to make it change. Not simple physical assault for this conduct. to rise above that in that special moment of temptation and to find within ourselves the spiritual capacity to rise above the instinct for revenge and anger and retaliation. Because if in fact we can find that place in us, which exists and abides in all of us as a species, if we can find that place, not only will we surprise our adversary, not only will we disarm this major potential calamity that we are in the present process of potentially bringing down upon ourselves, but we can in fact rise above that temptation, and we can show that we have a capacity that makes us not only worthy to sit on the Galactic Council as full equals to any other species in this civilization, but it will make us a party sought after. It will make us the most important people on that panel who have learned how to preserve our ability to love and to hate and to fear and to know what vengeance is, but at the same time without having to quell that in our being, without having to suppress it, without having to breed it out of our species, and therefore be wanting this in the future. We can in fact learn to control this and to keep it in check and to keep it as an asset, but to overcome it at the darkest moment. And then we will not have to sit and wait for them to come to us. Please, will you please come to us on our own terms? Can't you come down and help us out here? We, in fact, will be sought out from every corner of the galaxy to participate in the Federation, to share with them the insights of how you can at one and the same time love and forgive and still be capable of great other passions. That is the challenge that we are called to today. That is the possibilities that are before us today. And I ask you to not only join with us, but to reach out to all of your brothers and sisters and to share with them what it is that you uniquely know. What it is that causes you to be here this weekend, not out shopping, not out at ball games, not out just entertaining yourself, but coming here together today because you've come here to listen to one message and one message primarily. And that is, how is it that I can use the unique thing that I know to help my species grow and evolve and become saved? Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. We can send them to dinner. we can all do that.
Thank you, Danny. Guys, we got a big banquet, 7 o'clock upstairs.